Hi everyone. I've heard you want me to read you a chapter book, so I'm going to read you Mr. Stink, and it's by David Walliams. I like this book. I hope you like it too. Right, first chapter. Mr. Stink stank. He also stunk. And if it's correct English to say, he stinked and he stunked as well. He was the stinkiest stinker who ever lived. A stink is the worst type of smell. A stink is worse than a stench, and a stench is worse than a pong, and a pong is worse than a whiff, and a whiff can be enough to make your nose wrinkle. It wasn't Mr. Stink's fault that he stunk. He was a tramp. After all, he didn't have a home, and so he never had the opportunity to have a proper wash like you and me. After a while, the smell got worse and worse. Here's a picture of Mr. Stink. There's a picture, don't know if you can see it. He's quite a snappy dresser in his bow tie and tweed jacket, isn't he? But don't be fooled. The illustration doesn't do justice to the smell. This could be the scratchiest and sniffiest book, but the smell would be so bad you'd have to put it in the bin and then bury the bin very deep underground. That's the little white dog he has. She's called the Duchess. The Duchess wasn't a peculiar breed of dog. She was just a dog. Look, here she is. She smelt too, but not as bad as Mr. Stink. Nothing in the world really smelt as bad as him, except his beard. His beard was full of old bits of egg and sausage and cheese that had fallen out of his mouth years before. It had never ever been shampooed, so it had its own special stink, even worse than his main one. One morning, Mr. Stink simply appeared in this town and took up residence in an old wooden bench. No one knew where he had come from or where he might be going. The town folk were mostly nice to him. They sometimes dropped a few coins at his feet before rushing off with their eyes watering, but no one was really friendly towards him. No one stopped for a chat, at least not till the day that a little girl finally plucked up the courage to speak to him, and that's where our story begins. "Hello," said the little girl in her voice, trembling with the little nerves. The girl was called Chloe. She was 12, and she had never spoken to a tramp before. Her mother had forbidden her to speak to such creatures. Mother even disapproved of her daughter talking to the kids from the local council estate. But Chloe didn't think Mr. Stink was a creature. She thought he was a man who looked like he had a very interesting story to tell. And if there was one thing Chloe loved, that was stories. Every day she would pass him with his dog and her parents in the car on the way to their posh private school. Whether in sunshine or snow, he was always sitting on the same bench with his dog by his feet. As she luxuriated on the leather of the back seat of her poisonous little sister Annabelle, Chloe would look out of the window at him and wonder. Millions of thoughts and questions would swim through her head. Who was he? Why did he live on the streets? Had he never had a home? What did his dog eat? Did he have any friends or family? If so, did they know he was homeless? Where did he go for Christmas? If you wanted to write him a letter, what address would you put on the envelope? The bench, you know, the one round the corner from the bus stop. When was the last time he had a bath? And could his name really be Mr. Stink? Chloe was the kind of girl who loved being alone with her thoughts. Often she would sit on her bed and make up stories about Mr. Stink. Sitting on her own in her room, she would come up with all kinds of fantastical tales Maybe Mr. Stink was the heroic old sailor who had won dozens of medals for bravery, but had found it impossible to adapt to life on dry land. Or perhaps he was a world-famous opera singer who one night, upon hitting the top note in the air at the Royal Opera House in London, lost his voice and could never sing again. Or maybe he was really a Russian secret agent who had put on an elaborate tramp disguise to spy on the people of the town. Chloe didn't know anything about Mr. Stink, but what she did know on that day, when she stopped to talk to him for the first time, was that he looked like he needed the £5 note she was holding much more than she did. He seemed lonely too. Not just alone, but lonely in his soul. That made Chloe sad. She knew full well what it was like to feel lonely. Chloe didn't like school very much. Mother had insisted on sending her to a posh all-girls secondary school, and she hadn't made any friends there. Chloe didn't like being at home much either. Whenever she had the feeling that she didn't quite fit in there. What's more is that Chloe's least favourite time of year was Christmas. Everyone is supposed to love Christmas, especially children, but Chloe hated it. She hated the tinsel, she hated the crackers, she hated the carols, she hated having to watch the Queen's speech, she hated the mince pie, she hated that it never really snowed like it's supposed to. She hated sitting down with her family to a long, long dinner, and most of all, she hated how she had to pretend to be happy just because it was December the 25th. "What can I do for you, young lady?" said Mr. Stink. His voice was unexpectedly posh, as no one had ever stopped to talk to him before. He stared slightly unsuspiciously at the plump little girl. Chloe was suddenly a bit frightened. Maybe it wasn't such a good idea to talk to the old tramp after all. She had been working up to this moment for weeks and months even. This wasn't how it had all played out to be in her head. To make matters worse, Chloe had to stop breathing through her nose. The smell was started to get to her. It was like a living thing creeping up its way to her nostrils and turning its back on her throat. Well, sorry to bother you." "Yes?" said Mr. Stink, a little impatiently. Chloe was taken aback. Why was he such in a hurry? He always sat on his bench. It wasn't like he suddenly needed to go somewhere. At that moment, the Duchess started barking at her. Chloe felt even more scared. Sensing this, Mr. Stink pulled the Duchess's lead, which was really just like a bit of old rope to encourage her to be quiet. "Well," Chloe went on nervously, "my auntie sent me £5 to buy myself a Christmas present, but I don't really need anything, so I thought I would give it to you." Mr. Stink smiled. Chloe smiled too. For a moment, it looked as if he was going to accept Chloe's offer, and then he looked down at the pavement. "Thank you," he said, unimaginable kindness, "but I can't take it, sorry." Chloe was confused. "Why ever not?" she asked. You are but a child. £5? It's too generous. I just thought, it's really kind of you, but I'm afraid I can't accept it. Tell me how old you are, young lady." 10? 12, said Chloe loudly. She was a little shorter for her age, but liked to think she was grown up in lots of other ways. "I'm 12, 13 in January the 9th. "Sorry, you're 12, nearly 13. Go and buy yourself one of those new musical stereo discs. Don't you worry about an old vagabond like me," he smiled. There was a real twinkle in his eye. when he smiled. It's not that I'm rude, said Chloe. Can I ask you a question? Yes, of course you can. Well, I would love to know, why do you live on a bench and not in a house like me? Mr. Stink snuffled slightly and looked anxious. It's not a long story, my dear, he said. Maybe we'll tell you another day. Chloe was disappointed. She wasn't sure there would be another day. If her mother found out that she was even talking to this man, let alone offering him money, she would do her nut. Well, sorry for bothering you, said Chloe. Have a lovely day. And as the words came out, she cringed. What a stupid thing to say. How could he possibly have a lovely day? He was a smelly old tramp, and the sky was growing gloomy with black clouds. She took a few paces up the street, feeling embarrassed. What's that on your back, child? Called out Mr. Stink.